you chose an easy spot.
Chapter 21. I woke up in the dust of a cell, which was nicer than hanging upside down, but not by much. I groaned, pulling myself up from the ground. Oh, my body ached, and I shook the dust free. There was at least 4 inches of it along the ground. As I looked up, there was glaring red light shining through vertical and horizontal bars that surrounded me, and my mind still felt like it was asleep. At this point, I was thinking it was definitely because of the red ISO, the Erevin ISO. I found myself singing into Featherlife, which kind of became a habit. But that gave me a measure of clarity, fought back against the confusion from the glaring red light. And I looked around and finally noticed Scar, also unconscious, in the cell next to me. Now, my emotions up to that point were pretty level, but seeing Scar there on the ground both filled me with anger that they would hurt her, and also filled me with worry that they'd just taken down the two of us, one Prophithian. And that made me worry about the rest of the mission. I pounded my fist against the bars, thinking that we should have planned this better, that we should have known better, and I mean, we had a plan, which I feel like was better than other missions that we've had in the past, but even then it wasn't enough, and we'd been thoroughly bested. I only hoped that the rest of the Ceremaians were safe. I figured that the Prophithians would have punished us more if the mission had been a success, so it wasn't done. And now I just worried about what was left. And with all these thoughts was also the realization that Kana was right. I needed better balance with destiny. I trusted him to save us, and then he wasn't there at times that we needed him, not by his own fault, but yeah. I was pretty frustrated sitting there in the cell. Before long, Scar groaned and pulled herself up from the dust and shook it free from her hair. And I sang into Featherlife, singing to loosen the ring. I pulled it off and handed it to her through the bars. She didn't quite understand what was going on. I could tell she had the same confusion thing that I was feeling. But as she put the ring on and I sang into Featherlife, I could see her mind grow clear. And I pulled out Talonthorn, the sword, and sang into that as well, before realizing, wait, I still have Talonthorn. I still have my scabbard. They didn't take these things from me. And curiously, I reached into the scabbard and I pulled out a gate, and a gate back to Ceremea, and it, like, I could feel Ceremea through it. I thought, what? This was too easy. But as I reached out to try to overlap the worlds, there was something holding me back. I couldn't get a hold on Ceremea. And it must have been the ISO, the same red crystals, but I couldn't travel. I said, Scar, do you still have your lightsaber? And she said, I'd assume not, since I had it out when they abducted us. And I said, just check, I still have Talonthorn. And she finally looked over and reached into her pocket and pulled out her lightsaber, and she said, what? What? Like, they have to know who we are. Do they know how easily we could escape? She said, this has to be a test of some kind. At that moment, a door opened, and a Prophithian came out wearing the same multicolored robes. And they had the face paint as well, the white and gray that made it look like a skull, though not nearly as intricate as the Grand Seer that I'd been talking to before. But this Prophithian wore a choker of wood and red crystal that didn't seem to affect it, but as it drew near, focusing became difficult even with Talonthorn's help. The Prophithian said, "Come, humans," and opened our cell doors. And almost against my will, I walked out, and the Prophithian closed us into a room. I kind of came back to myself. I wasn't sure if we'd walked through a maze in the dust-filled dungeon, or, if we'd just taken a few steps, but the red ISO was gone, and it was just Scar and me in a dark metal room, light coming through a shaft on one of the walls far above, and I could hear Prophithian voices on the far side. My earbuds couldn't make out what was being said. There were too many voices. But Scar went up to the wall and, using her magic in a way I hadn't seen before, crawled up the wall and looked through the slit and said, "Oh no, you're going to want your ring back." And I said, "Why?" As she tossed the ring back and I put Featherlife back on my finger. She said, "You remember the ancient Rome, the Colosseum?" Before I could respond, the huge metal wall with the slit began to move, squeaking as the door opened, and the faint voices became a wave of sound. Thousands and thousands of Prophithians sat above the arena, about 20 feet above us, and in between us was a big chain net with every cross-section bearing an Erevin ISO. There was also red ISO all along the bottom of the arena and throughout the pitted, rocky area in front of us. There was nowhere else to go. Scar and I stepped forward and into the arena. And the cheering and chanting grew louder. It was like a tribal mystic fan section at the Super Bowl. But all around us, all these Prophithians, from a box to the side of us, the same seer that I'd spoken to before shouted out above the crowd, her voice booming across the arena, saying, "Let's see how truth fights without her greatest warriors." But in not as eloquent of words, because the translation just did not work out. Anyway, I said, "Scar, think you can get us out of here?" The chains were up high, and I had no doubt that Scar could get to them and break through, but I didn't have siring, and it'd be hard for Scar to jump me up there. She said, "Probably, but I kind of want to see who or what they would send to fight against us." And I thought, of course. I said, "Well, you're going to have to do this on your own, because I am not going to be of help." And she said, "Well, you could copy my abilities." And even then, I did not have a good track record recently for my fighting. And without Destiny, I was just a lot less confident than I had been earlier this morning. But before I could respond, a booming sound came from across the arena. Something slammed against the door on the far side. I thought, what did that Prophithian say about a beast? At that moment, I heard the most horrifying sound I have ever heard, a bestial cry that lent the sound of metal grinding against metal. The door began to open, and before it had gotten far, a figure contorted out of the door and began galloping across the arena towards us, glowing maroon runes in its patchy fur and lanky hide. Scar screamed, "Go!" as the Teletubby raced forward. She drew her lightsaber and pulled a shield from her other pocket. And I hadn't moved. I was frozen in fear, so she kicked me backward and ran towards the Teletubby. And as it came toward her, she ducked underneath it and sliced off one of its rear legs. And as she came out, she used her shield to block a tail covered in spines That was new. The Teletubby spun around, and Scar turned to face it, and its back leg was already healing back up as it reared forward. She held her shield above her with a hand and a half, as the Teletubby came down and slammed against the shield. And she held against the weight of the Teletubby. One of its paws slipped and it hit the ground, and she was quick to slash out with her lightsaber, and she cut off its leg. The leg began to regrow quickly, but the Teletubby still hit the ground and came down right on top of her blade. The Prophithians roared as as her lightsaber came up through the back of its head, and she ripped it forward through the face. The Teletubby fell still and dropped to the ground, and Scar threw her lightsaber and shield to the ground and pulled away, gasping, reaching into her pocket for a Felit ISO crystal. I hadn't seen it, but at some point it had gotten a claw into her side, and her jacket was shredded all along one side where blood was seeping through. She held her crystal up to the wound and gasped, but it didn't seal up, and she looked in confusion at the crystal. I met her eyes, and we realized that Erevan ISO crystal was going to be affecting everything that we did. I began to step towards her, but froze as the Teletubby stood back up, its face resealing. It whined in pain, and with its face split open, the sound was worse than its cry had ever been. Scar dropped the crystal and reached out, summoning the lightsaber back to her hand, but the Teletubby turned from her, seeking easier prey. My eyes widened as I sprinted away from it as fast as I could. I know there was no escaping it, but my every instinct told me I had to get away as far as I could before I had to face this thing. I ran back, singing into Talonthorn and Featherlife as the Teletubby came around, and I spun forward at the last moment, prepared to die a valiant death. And, wishing that I copied Scar's abilities even just for a little bit of help. But wait. At that moment, the Teletubby took me down, slammed its paw into me, and threw me to the ground. My vision went red as I felt the Teletubby's claw pierce through my body, ripping through tendons and piercing organs. Its venom, acidic, bleeding into my body. Its fangs were coming down on my face, and I focused all of my energy in singing out as loud as I could through my punctured lungs, singing Featherlife's full note. It was enough to copy the Teletubby's magic, which coursed from the Teletubby into me, re-knitting my muscles and putting my bones back together as I felt its energy and healing fill me with the strength of a Teletubby. I threw my fist forward and I slammed its face to the side, its maw closing on open air. With my other hand, I grabbed Talonthorn from the ground and came around, slicing its head off, which it fell to the ground, and its body fell limp. I threw it off of me, pulling its claw from my abdomen, and I immediately began to reseal. Oh, though that was going to leave lasting effects, the mental damage that caused. But as my body fixed and I stood back up, something was still wrong. And it wasn't the feeling of air on my organs, it was something worse. The Teletubby's head had already begun to regrow, and it pulled itself away, whining again, and my eyes locked on the ebony plates along its underside. I'd never focused too much on those plates, but that was the source of the Teletubby's power, and it was evil. And as the Teletubby growled at me, I realized it wasn't a cry of intimidation. It was a cry of crippling pain. I could feel the influence of the plates on my mind eating away at my soul, at what made me good, at what made me G. I still wanted to run from this Teletubby, but this was no longer a fight to survive. This was a fight to save. I held Talonthorn in my hand, and I could see as the Teletubby fell back under the influence of these plates so evil that whatever was done to create them destroyed the world that they had come from. The Teletubby sprang towards me, and I ducked underneath, using Talonthorn and jamming it up in between some of the plates. I sang Talonthorn's full note with everything I had, but it had no effect on the plates. I ducked as the Teletubby ran under and evaded its tail. I threw Talonthorn to the ground. That was going to be useless. I had to do this myself. I threw myself high into the air using the strength of a Teletubby, trying to twist out of the way of its claws as they came up. One of them still caught my leg and tore clean through, which left me to gasp in pain as I came down on the Teletubby's back. I clung to the fur as my leg resealed, avoiding its head as it came back to try to bite me. And its claw came next, and I evaded that, and its tail came whistling past, and I spun to the other side, clinging to its fur. I reached down to its underbelly to make contact with the plates, but my hand froze. I couldn't force myself to touch the midnight black plates. But with all the force I could muster, I finally reached forward enough to make contact. Immediately everything went dark and silent. The arena vanished, but so did Saramea. Scar was gone. Andrew vanished. My parents became barely a memory. Everything that I was being meticulously eaten away by the darkness, replaced with hatred and fear. I couldn't scream. I couldn't sob. For centuries, I felt this darkness filling my soul. But somewhere within the miles of darkness, a voice spoke out. Words that Reggie Ballast had once said, but it wasn't his voice. It was Darren's. I heard his voice say, "I'm not doing this because anyone told me to. I'm doing this because it's right." A connection that made me gasp, and with that human emotion, I regained presence of who I was, where I was. I wasn't perfect, but I tried. When I found something that was good, I did it. I was the person that would hold up the universe, not because of my strength, but because it had to be done. My vision cleared back into the arena. I screamed and ripped the plates off of the Teletubby's front. One of them fell to the ground, and I held it under my foot as I clutched the others in my arms. And I screamed in pure defiance at the plates, holding my good against their evil. I screamed with everything I had, and the plates began to tremble and shake and convulse until one by one they exploded into obsidian dust, which dissolved into nothingness. The arena was silent. Scar still crouched a distance away, clutching her side as blood flowed between her fingers, but her attention was completely on me. Even the Teletubby was frozen for a moment before it jumped up and began to roll on the ground like a puppy. The screams began a moment later. That's right, I thought. That's what happens when you try to hurt people. The Prophithians scrambled, trying to leave the arena. As I stepped forward, and the Teletubby pulled itself up and began to nuzzle me. It was still terrifying, and every sound that it made was chilling, but I could sense its exultant joy. It was free. We were free. I pushed him away playfully. I noticed that my hand was pitch black, as were my arms and most of my legs. I could see it on the bridge of my nose. I was covered in this darkness, and I couldn't even feel it. It wouldn't rub off. I thought, okay, that's something I'm going to have to worry about later. Until then, there was some retribution to be made. I grabbed Talonthorn from the ground and used the Teletubby's super strength to throw myself onto its back. I turned to Scar and I said, "Can you get out of here?" And she nodded feebly. I said, "As soon as you're free from that red ISO, you should be free to heal." And she said, "All right." I said, "I'll take care of the rest of this." She threw herself up into the chains and grunted as she hit the chains and pulled herself on top of the net. But she took off into the sky, and I knew she'd be fine. I turned to the Teletubby, Crimson. That seemed a fitting name, and it felt right. I said, "You ready to cause some chaos?" I could tell he couldn't understand the words, but even though the plate was gone, there was still a mental connection of some kind, and he knew exactly what I was saying. He yipped, and that sound echoed through the arena and promptly shattered all of the ISO around. The red dust fell around us and covered us with a glowing red blanket, leaving the rest of the arena in darkness and leaving the Prophithians even more terrified. But I wasn't going to fight them. I wasn't going to kill them. I would send them back to becoming, but I still held firm that I was not going to kill one more Prophithian than I had to. But Crimson threw us to the top of the net and pulled his way up onto the chains. It was a little bit hard to get from there onto the arena. The chains were really wobbly, but we got to the stands. And we were ready to finish this mission. End of chapter 21.